And we're here with Dr. Andrew Steele, who is a scientist, writer, presenter, and author of Ageless. Dr. Steele, welcome to the Optimal Performance Podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure for being here.
So this is maybe going to sound like a random first question, but this is the first question that I ask most of my guests who are in the field of nutrition or fitness or in scientific research, because I want to know who's putting their money where their mouth is, or vice versa. So if you would share with me, what time is it where you are and what you have put into your body today?
Oh, that's a good question. So currently it's the evening in the UK. It's about 5 p.m. And what have I put into my body? Well, I've had some fruit for breakfast. I had fruit, sort of berries and a bit of porridge oats and various nuts and seeds. And then for lunch, I had some pasta with pesto. And the worst thing was a vegetarian Frankfurter. That's probably that's my little sin for the day. My wife's German, so we tucked into some fake Frankfurters.
Interesting. Okay. Any supplements or longevity drugs or anything quite like that?
The only thing that I've taken, and I'm taking at the moment, is vitamin D. And the reason for that is coronavirus. So I looked into vitamin D a while ago, and basically the evidence for it for all-cause mortality is really, up and down. You get different people saying different things. Some people say it's a wonder drug. Some people say it doesn't do anything. And when you get those kinds of conflicting results, my instinct is that, obviously there probably is some effect in there somewhere, but it's sufficiently small that scientists and nutritionists and doctors aren't able to tease out exactly what the benefits are. So I've always been a bit skeptical about vitamin D. I started taking it for a while, a couple of winters ago. I sort of came off it again because I thought, the evidence wasn't really there. But then with coronavirus, there's all this stuff about, whether vitamin D can potentially prevent or make the infection less serious. Now, actually, I don't even necessarily believe that it will. I think it's quite unlikely that it's going to have a significant effect. But honestly, I'll just take anything that gives me a small chance of a better outcome. So I'm taking it prophylactically because honestly, the flip side of it not having much effect on all-cause mortality is it's not killing you, because there are certain supplements that can reduce your life expectancy, of course. So given that it probably isn't going to have any effect and it's got a small chance of helping me, I'm happy to sort of take that risk. But other than that, I really don't think there are any supplements that are worth taking. And I try and eat healthily. I try and get a bit of exercise. There's a health advice chapter in the book, and actually one of my bits of health advice is don't bother with supplements unless you've got a specific nutritional deficiency. You've got something you've spoken to your doctor about. And actually, most supplements probably won't really do anything, because your body, if it'll basically just wee out the vitamins it doesn't need, or anything like that. And these huge meta-analyses, the biggest trials you can get, these systematic reviews where they pull together all of the different trials that have been done on these supplements, they show that some of them have no effect, some of them slightly reduce life expectancy, and there's nothing you can really do that's reliably proven to improve life expectancy. So I'm just waiting for the real longevity drugs to hit the market potentially in the next few years.
Interesting. Okay, cool. I definitely want to circle back to that, because we've had the creators of nicotinamide riboside and NAD on the podcast and have dove into that before, but we'll circle back around to that. On the vitamin D track, I mean, you and I are both, you're in the UK and I'm in Seattle, and we're just not getting any sunshine. And so if we can't get the sunshine from that big yellow ball that I haven't seen in probably 10 months, you're probably in a similar situation. So getting that, that supplemental vitamin D. Yeah, I'm with you. May or may not work. Might as well try it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've had an absolutely grim winter here. It's been the greyest winter I think I can remember, and especially with lockdown, so I haven't even been going out as much as I normally would. Yeah. So yeah, basically anything you can do to try and get yourself a little bit of vitamin D is probably for the best.
Yeah, well, we should probably take a vacation, you and me. I mean, you're in the middle of a book launch. I mean, you told me it's launched in the UK and it's launching now. Maybe now's not a great time for you to go take off to Barbados for a couple of weeks, but
maybe when it's all over, maybe when that's blown over and the pandemic's sort of dying down a bit, that'll be my time.
There you go. So I would love to start with this. I love this topic of conversation. Ageless, the new science of getting older without getting old. Something that I am really fascinated by. There's a lot of information. There's an increasing amount of information coming out, and based on the reviews, it sounds like you've done a really good job of explaining it to people, and laid out where we're at in this endeavor to live longer and live healthier. I would love to start by hearing just a little bit about your background. How is it that you became so entrenched and fascinated with longevity?
Yeah, I've got quite an interesting background in that respect, because I actually started out as a physicist. My PhD, even I got as far as that, I did a PhD in magnetism at Oxford. And toward the end of that PhD, I started reading a bit more about aging and longevity. And I often tell people that I changed career because of a graph, and that is slightly glib, but it's only slightly. And the reason for that is I looked at the graph of your mortality risk with time as a human being. And so if you look at this graph, it's obviously it's a bit of a morbid graph. It basically shows that your risk of death doubles every 7 or 8 years. So I'm in my 30s. That means my risk of death every year is somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000. And it's worth sort of thinking about what that means. Like if those odds were to continue into the indefinite future, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. So clearly the human body is capable in youth of, maintaining itself at an incredible level of fitness, an incredible unlikelihood of dying, for those first few decades of life. But the problem is, because it starts doubling every 7 or 8 years, it can start out fairly small and then end up getting very big very quickly. So if you make it to your 65th birthday, you've got about a 1% chance of not making it to 66. If you make it to 80, you've got about a 5% chance of dying that year. And if you're lucky enough to live into your 90s, then your odds of death in any one of those years are about 1 in 6. So it's sort of life and death at the roll of a dice. And obviously, as a human, that's quite a scary thing. You've got this sort of terrifying wall of mortality bearing down upon all of us that's going to sort of kick in our 60s or 70s or 80s, depending. But as a scientist, you look at that graph and you think there must be something underlying this process. You've got this incredible increase in the risk of cancer and the risk of heart disease and the risk of dementia and the risk of stroke, just the risk of everything. Your frailty goes up. Every part of your body just starts falling apart pretty much on a schedule. And so what that suggests is there must be some process that's driving this degeneration, that's driving the sort of simultaneity of this going on. And then I started reading more about the sort of results in aging and longevity, the fact that we can slow these things down in the lab quite reliably with loads of different interventions. And actually, in the sort of 10 years since I started thinking about this stuff, the number of results that's been coming in has just been, it's been getting faster and faster. You've just got dozens of different ways now that we can slow and reverse the aging process in cells, in animals, in the lab. And we're just starting human trials. So during that whole time, I've just been really, really excited watching this whole field come on. And I decided at that point, I had to get into biology. I had to understand, what the fuss was about. Maybe there was something that as a physicist I'd missed. There was some complexity. There was some reason that biologists weren't like diving into this as the most important. I call it in the book the most important humanitarian challenge of our time, because just the vast majority of people are killed ultimately by aging, because they're killed by the cancer, they're killed by heart disease, they're killed by all of these diseases that strike in late life. So I was really compelled. I went into biology, and the more biology I learned, I didn't find anything that discredited this idea. Basically, I found more and more exciting results. But also, I found as I spoke to biologists, I'd speak to really talented biologists that might have great degrees from great universities, or I'd speak to my wife, actually is a doctor. And when I first talked to her about this stuff, she thought I was crazy, and that's because they don't get lectures on aging biology in a normal biology degree or in a normal medical degree. And that means that they don't approach aging in this way. They don't approach it as a sort of treatable medical problem. They think about it as something that's natural, a sort of process of wearing out that isn't worthy of much discussion. And so the reason I ended up writing a book was because, I saw this huge promise, and I saw this massive lack of recognition within science, within the public, within policymakers. And I just thought, I've got to try and get the word out there. So that's, I guess, what I'm doing now.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I like the idea of that, which is, you were looking for ways to discredit what you were reading. I think that's like pure scientific endeavor, right? Is to like prove me wrong. What can I find that can debunk this? And that level of research from that angle, I think resonates with people. It's like I could be wrong, but what I'm seeing supports this. I'm just going to keep digging and digging and digging. So many different cool questions. The question that I'd like to start with is, based on what you've been able to surmise from your research, what are the most reliable tests for actual aging? Are you a telomere guy? Are you a senescent cell guy? Like what based on what you know, what's the best way to measure aging?
This really runs the gamut, and I think sort of the most sciencey sounding one is the epigenetic clocks. This idea that if you look at the epigenetic marks on somebody's DNA, and in particular the most studied one is methylation. These are little chemicals that basically attach to all different locations on your genome, and what they do is they instruct the genome how to behave in particular cells at particular times. So every cell in your body has this 2 meters of DNA. It's the same 6 billion or so letters, and nonetheless, these cells behave wildly differently. We've got blood cells, we've got brain cells, we've got muscle cells, we've got eye cells, all of which fulfill remarkably different functions. And although they've got a few core similarities, like they've all got a cell membrane, they've all got a nucleus, or apart from the blood cells, there are various different things that they do really, really differently. Like neurons express particular proteins, muscles express particular proteins that allow them to fulfill that function. And it's the epigenetics, these marks on the DNA that basically say read this bit, ignore this bit, and allow the cells to fulfill all those different things, and also to fulfill the functions they need at different times in your life as well. Because obviously a muscle cell, when you're exercising, is doing a very different thing to a muscle cell when you've just had a meal, is doing a very different thing to a muscle cell when you're asleep, and so on and so on. So a lot of this is controlled by these epigenetic marks. And what people found as they were studying them is that you could actually use these marks to build a sort of scarily accurate epigenetic clock. And you can use the original clock used just 353 sites. So obviously these things happen in millions and millions of places across your genome. And yet with just 300 of them, you can predict someone's age to within about 4 or 5 years. And more morbidly, you can predict how likely they are to die. So if you've got an epigenetic age that's advanced compared to your chronological age, how long ago you were born, then what that suggests is you're likely to be less healthy and you're likely to die sooner. And obviously the sort of mercifully the converse is also true. So if your epigenetic age is younger than your your biological age, therefore is younger than your chronological age, then you're probably going to be healthier and live a little bit longer in good health, at least statistically speaking. And these clocks have been refined. They're getting better and better at predicting the likelihood of disease and stuff like that. So I think ultimately, maybe not ultimately, but they're certainly the strongest contender for a sort of scientific blood test style aging predictor that we've got now. That said, there's some really serious competition from the far more sort of basic sounding side. Like a lot of these aging tests do things like they measure your grip strength, or they measure the amount of time you can stand on one leg, so sort of balance and that sort of thing. And what I think you find is that actually, in terms of predicting your frailty, in terms of predicting how likely you are to die, those sort of measures do really well as well. So I think there are all kinds of different things you could do. I think epigenetic clocks probably give you the best single number. But actually maybe things like grip strength and balance, they're more related to the tasks that we actually want to do in everyday life. Like, why do I care about getting old? Obviously I care about getting sick, but I also care about being able to get around the house and, maybe play with my grandkids or whatever it is that, my aspirations at that age. So yeah, I really think there's a whole variety of different things that work. And then the corollary of all of this is that although these are ways of sort of assigning a single number to your biological age, I guess that ultimately that might not be the way that we play this, because it might be that, for example, the accumulation of senescent cells, it's an aspect of aging. It's called a hallmark of aging. And so, maybe you'll go to your doctor. What they want to do is measure your burden of senescent cells, maybe not even in your whole body. Maybe they'll look in specific tissues. Then they might give you some drugs to get rid of those senescent cells. And so I think, although, now we think of age as being a single number, I think as we slowly start to learn to treat certain aspects of the aging process, it's going to become a whole variety of numbers. It's going to be how many senescent cells do you have, how long are your telomeres, and then even drill down further. How many senescent cells do you have in your liver versus your brain? How many, how long are your telomeres in your blood versus your muscles? And we're going to, hopefully at some point, and this isn't something that's going to happen in the next 5 years. This is something that's sort of in the further future. But we're going to be tailoring those treatments for aging toward the aspects of aging that you're, effectively suffering from the most.
Right. Oh, that's cool. I love that that's very cool. So as it grows in our ability to test these things with the epigenetic clocks, and tell me if I've got this right, that someday in the future, hopefully not too far out, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 rather than 5 or 50, is some confluence of tests, right? The science is there, but we haven't quite put it together yet. So it's telomere length, it's epigenetic markers, it's, fulfilling relationships, grip strength, stress factors, cortisol presence, and so forth. Is that kind of right? Like, is that how you see it in the future? Is that it's going to be a whole, dossier of different factors that ultimately come out with this holistic picture of how old we are biologically?
Yeah, and I think it's probably not going to be one single age. I think you might almost have a senescence age and a telomere age, and ages that all basically vary by the therapies that we have available. Because I think what we're going to do is we develop a drug that can kill these senescent cells. We're going to want to remove those senescent cells, and then ultimately we're going to want to remove them in the parts of the body where they're causing you the most problems. Maybe it's in your lungs, maybe it's in your liver, maybe it's in your brain, depending on your genetics, whether you smoked, for example, or other aspects of your health history. So I really hope that in the long run, and like you say, sort of, whether it's 15 years or 20 or 30 years away, we are going to start to be able to tailor these treatments much more toward the actual aspects of aging that are, causing you in particular, putting you at risk of disease or putting you at risk of frailty and so on.
Yeah, super cool. When you were deciding how to put this book together, doing the research and sort of plotting out the different chapters and the different topics that you were going to dive into, I'm curious. I'm always curious about the process. What made you put together the book in the way that you did? Like, it's a super broad question, but I think it tells a lot about where your mind was at when you were researching this stuff.
It's a real challenge, and it was a very difficult book to structure because there's just so much, and it's all so interconnected. So, for example, we just talked about telomeres and senescent cells. The fact is that the shortening of the telomeres is one of the things that drives cells into senescence. So, you've got all these processes that are happening. They're happening at the same time. They're influencing each other. They're sometimes feeding back on themselves. So the way that I did it, I think not just me as an author, but all of us in the aging biology field have been really fortunate to have these sort of categorizations of the aging process. And the most highly cited one is this paper called The Hallmarks of Aging that came out in 2013. And what that paper does is it groups aging-related changes into 9 distinct categories. And so therefore, I use that as a sort of framework to try and advise how I structured the book. So there are 2 reasons that that's interesting. First off is because it allows you to break them up into there's a taxonomy, there's a classification. But secondly, this classification actually breaks relatively cleanly up into how we're going to treat those different aspects as well. So, for example, we keep mentioning senescent cells, that they are a very prominent part of the aging dialogue at the moment. They are one of the hallmarks of aging. And obviously, therefore, the way that you treat them is either to get rid of those senescent cells, or it's to have drugs or treatments that can reduce the effect that they have on the body by dialing down the different chemistry that they secrete. Anyway, so that's a very good sort of logical way to lay out the book, and that's how I started. But it's just incredibly challenging because you end up trying to. I actually started out by explaining basically each hallmark as a chapter, then how we might go about treating that hallmark. But it just meant that we had these enormous, unwieldy science chapters, and I was very, very fortunate to have some incredible editors whose main feedback after my first draft was basically, right, we're going to completely restructure this. And they were so what we ended up doing was putting all the sort of causes of aging at the beginning, and then putting the ways that we're going to treat those causes in the second part of the book. And I think that just makes a lot more sense because it sort of lays out all the biology, and then it allows you to talk about how you're going to fix it and how all those different fixes relate to each other. And my sort of broader writing process was just, I tried to be as exhaustive as I could be. I think I read, well, in my bibliography software, I've got something like 1,000 papers, and I can't promise that I've read every single one of them, from abstract to the conclusions, but I've at least skimmed all of those papers. And about 400 references made it into the back of the book. And that's not just papers, it's things like YouTube videos or articles that I found in the press that sort of go into more depth about particular things that there wasn't space for in the book. So I just tried to read absolutely as much as I could. And then after that, I just tried to speak to some of the leading experts, because the fact is that, for starters, I was, began as a physicist, so there might have been bits of biology that I'd missed out, as part of my education. But secondly, even if you are an absolute biology expert, this field is just so broad. It really impacts on every aspect of our cells, of our bodies, of the systems that make us up. And so what I tried to do is speak to at least 1 or 2 scientists from every, working on every particular specialism. So someone on senescent cells, someone working on telomeres, and so on, just to make sure that I'd covered every single base. And what I really found was very useful about that is the scientific literature is often a few years out of date, because it's the time it takes to prepare a paper and get it all the way so absolutely all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, everything's ready for publication. And often it can take months or even years to go through the peer review process, because these peer reviewers make incredibly stringent demands. They might ask for experiments to be redone. And so there were a couple of cases where I went and spoke to scientists, and they basically said, yeah, that is what the literature says, but actually if you look at the very most recent papers that you might have missed, and some work that we've done that has sort of is continuing down these lines, we can actually overturn some of these results that are look a bit more dated now. So I think that sort of dual-pronged approach of really doing a deep dive into the literature, but then chatting to some experts to make sure that you haven't missed anything. I hope I've been absolutely as thorough as I could be, and I've really tried to be. So that was my approach. And I'm just part of my problem as an author is that I'm quite a perfectionist. So I think it took me a long time to write. It took me about 2 years to, from start to finish to write this book. And that's doing it full time, basically. I did a few other bits and bobs on the side, but I quit my postdoc to give myself time to focus on this. And I'm so glad I did, because I just, this exhaustive process, I don't think I could have done it alongside a full-time science job as well.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Especially for someone who's so data driven, who's so focused on what the data show. You've got to be able to put so many different pieces together and connect so many different dots. I'd love to hear a little bit about what was one thing that really surprised you? Like what was a either a marker or an anecdote or a piece of data that when you came across it, just like you had never heard before, it was just like totally shocking or counter to what you had assumed previously?
I think the thing that's really surprised me, and it's the thing in the book that has me on the one hand most optimistic, and on the other hand most baffled by the occurrence. And that is this idea of rejuvenation by reprogramming cells, by reprogramming using the Yamanaka factors, which are these genes that were discovered in order to reprogram cells from an adult cell. So you could take a cell from your skin or something, you can reprogram it into what's called a pluripotent state. And that's a state that that these cells normally have. They're the stem cells at the very beginning of embryonic development are pluripotent. It means they can develop into any cell in the body, basically. And so that's how Yamanaka discovered them back in 2006. He was looking for this sort of ability to create pluripotent stem cells. But what has subsequently been discovered is that these genes don't just wind back the sort of developmental clock in cells. They also seem to wind back the aging clock. And people have started putting these cells into animals. And the first thing that they did was, they put the genes into animals, and they found that unfortunately, it basically wipes out the animal. They die very, very quickly. The reason being that it turns the cells in the animal into pluripotent stem cells, and this can kill them in sort of a two-pronged way. The first prong is that pluripotent stem cells may be incredibly powerful in terms of the cells that they can become, but they're absolutely hopeless at actually doing stuff. Like if your heart cells are suddenly replaced by a bunch of pluripotent stem cells, they can't beat, they can't pump blood, and so you're going to die. You're going to have some kind of massive organ failure. So that's one of the problems. The second problem is that if you just inject these genes in and make pluripotent stem cells inside a mouse, then you get these things called teratomas. They're a kind of cancer that develops from pluripotent stem cells, and they're absolutely grotesque things. They're these sort of horrible matted hair, teeth, skin, sometimes little bits of eyeball or brain, because these cells, they can develop into anything, and they aren't being given any instructions, so they're just sort of randomly differentiating, turning into all kinds of disgusting nonsense. And they're well worth seeking out, these tumors. I think if you ever find yourself in an anatomical museum, you can find these things. They were sort of Victorian collectibles because nobody really knew what was causing them. These horrible little things, sometimes they've got whole human teeth embedded in them, just disgusting, deformed. They're incredible. They're absolutely amazing. Anyway, this has been a very long-winded way of getting to the point that if you just administer these factors continuously, the mice have a very bad time of it. However, scientists gave these genes to mice, and they gave them in such a way that the genes would only be activated when the mice were taking a particular drug. And so then they gave that drug intermittently. I think they gave it 2 days a week, basically, 2 days out of 7. And what they found was that was just long enough to sort of give the cells a bit of a spring clean and wind back. Actually, it wound back the epigenetic clock, which is what we were mentioning earlier, and sort of change some of the properties of various other parts of the cell. It improved the behavior of the mitochondria, the energy generating part of the cell, and that kind of stuff. And basically made the mice biologically younger and healthier. And I'd heard of that result before, but as I sort of dug into it, it's just so incredible that these genes that were discovered for an entirely different purpose were able to wind back the biological clock inside these cells and therefore inside these whole organisms. And they can do really crazy things. Like, so if you give these pluripotency factors to a cell that's a cancer cell line in a lab, you can reverse some aspects of that cancer. It seems to sort of put, cells that are in chaos, it seems to sort of restore order to those cells. And I just find this absolutely amazing because I think if you told a scientist in the year 2000 that there were 4 genes that you could give to a mouse, and as long as you did it intermittently, it could wind back many aspects of that mouse's cellular aging and effectively make it biologically younger, they just wouldn't have believed you. And the reason it makes me so optimistic is because I think we've just been really fortunate that these genes do happen to do this thing. It's like it's entirely conceivable from a sort of an abstract theoretical biological perspective, I guess, that you could come up with some genes that could turn a normal cell into an induced pluripotent stem cell, but wouldn't have this sort of wide-ranging effect winding back the biological clock. But it just so happens that we've stumbled upon these genes that do that. And that means we've got this sort of proof of principle. And the reason that the way that I temper this optimism, I'm not sure this is ready for the human prime time anytime particularly soon, because these are powerful genes. You get that impression because they can turn a regular adult body cell into a stem cell. And you get that because they can reverse this biological clock. And so, just deploying these things willy-nilly in humans would probably be quite a risky endeavor, particularly because of this risk of cancer, this risk of organ failure. But the fact that it's shown us this proof of principle so early on in the process, it demonstrates that this potential is, locked away inside our cells, ready to be deployed. And that just makes me really excited. It's just another completely off the wall way that we can reverse the aging process. And even if it doesn't directly lead to a treatment, it just shows us the potential that lies within all of our cells. And, it's really inspirational for scientists working on this to show us that we can do it this way, and maybe there are other ways that we can do it as well.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's news on me. I've not heard any of that before. That's really fascinating. Man. Yeah. I'm just thinking about how
it's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, how far out are we from, are we 10, 20, 30? Thing is, like, these advancements, the these breakthroughs that we have in science. Again, you said if you'd have talked to somebody in 2010 about this, they'd have been like, "You're nuts." And 11 years on, we have this new awareness, and then from that awareness, other ideas come out of, and it's just sort of, it's like the spreading effect of where we can take these technologies and treatments, and or even just the knowledge that cells can do this, that these genes can do that. It's incredible. I'm sort of curious about, now knowing what you know and having put together all of these different variables in the aging process. I'm curious about some vernacular. The word anti-aging is popular. The word of age reversal is popular. Transhumanism. These are all considerations about how that are concerned specifically with age, aging, death, dying, how we can stay younger longer. How involved are you, or interested are you in those three sort of key terms, as it pertains to what you know? Like, are you going to rush out? Because for some context, I was a little surprised to hear that you're not taking NAD, right? A little surprised to hear that some of these, some with the strongest science behind them. NAD, I think, is certainly the strongest scientific standing of any sort of longevity drug. But then, as it gets to your perspective of all the things that you know, how do you think of those three terms: anti-aging, age reversal, or transhumanism? Like, what really resonates for you?
I use anti-aging sort of unapologetically throughout the book, and it's quite controversial sometimes in sort of the serious science of biogerontology, because there's this sort of checkered history full of quacks, and even now there's skin cream and stuff which claims to be anti-aging but really isn't anything of the sort. And I think there is a sort of language problem here, because I talk towards the end of the sort of science part of the book that when we eventually get beyond some of these treatments, the first generation of anti-aging treatments are going to be these things, treating these hallmarks that I've discussed. But I think ultimately we're going to come to think of this as, and this sort of sounds a bit sort of new age, but it's going to come to be restoring balance in the body, or in science we call it homeostasis. And ultimately, it's basically anything that gets out of balance. If you start getting too many senescent cells, we'll remove some of those senescent cells, and that's going to bring you back into the normal range. And so I think aging is a really unfortunate word, because it's got all these connotations. I think people have a lot of associations with it. They think of it as a sort of natural process, or they might think of it as a something to be aspired to age well, to become wiser, to have kids, have grandkids, gain standing in the world, and all that kind of thing. It's not entirely a bad process, and it's not a purely biological process either. There's a lot of psychology and all sorts of other stuff that goes into it. So it's a really tricky sort of field of language, because when you say you want to cure aging, which is something that I say, people sometimes look at you a bit weird.
Yeah.
And that's because it sounds like you're trying to cure a natural process. What I'm interested in doing, I don't think that things like accruing wisdom is not a bad thing, but becoming at more risk of disease, becoming frail, becoming less independent are unambiguously bad things. And so I've ended up, adopting that word aging and adopting that word anti-aging. But you have got to be aware that these things do come with sort of wider social baggage, I think. And I'm not sure that there's a simple way to square that circle. Because if you want to explain this concept to someone in 5 minutes, you've got to call it aging. You've got to say aging causes all these diseases. We want to cure this thing called aging. If you want to explore, explain this to someone over the course of a book, I eventually get to the point of saying that we're going to call these treatments reversal of loss of homeostasis. But you don't want to call it that. If you're saying, in your first 5 minutes when you're chatting to someone's mum, that's not how you're going to try and pitch the idea, is it?
Right.
So that's the sort of anti-aging side of things. Age reversal, again, it's thrown around a lot by various people peddling various pills and potions in this day and age. But I think it's a viable idea, because if you remove senescent cells from a mouse, from a human, what you're doing is you're taking an aspect of the aging process and you are reversing it. Because if you measure your age by the percentage of your cells in a particular organ that are senescent, and then that percentage goes down, then in that respect at least your age has been reversed. And I think there's a lot of talk about slowing aging versus reversing aging, and I think it becomes a bit of a semantic distinction at some point, because the fact is that if you remove a lot of the senescent cells from a mouse, you do reverse that aspect of its aging process. Ultimately, you probably only, in inverted commas, slow its overall degeneration with age. There aren't many things that are made better, but a lot of things are slowed down. But I think as we get better at slowing, we're going to sort of tip over the edge into reversing. I think it's really hard to draw a hard line between something that only slows down the aging process and something that reverses it. So I'm very happy to talk about age reversal. I don't think there's anything we have that can do that for humans now, but I don't think it's there's nothing wrong with the term implicitly. And transhumanism, that's a fascinating one. That's it's not a word I use at all in the book, and it's something that I've obviously read quite a lot about. And I think the sort of goals of transhumanism, in as far as it's to sort of emancipate humans beyond our biological foibles. And, what we want to do, ultimately, the reason I care about aging is because I want to get rid of as much suffering as possible. And the reason you want to get rid of that suffering is so that humans have more time to, ultimately, I love science and I love reading about and understanding the world. Other people love art or music or whatever it is they're into. You want to be able to give people space to flourish, basically. And that can be a whole variety of different things. And to the extent that that's what transhumanism is about, I'm fully on board. But the problem is that when you talk to people about transhumanism, they often think about, brain uploading and colonizing the universe and that kind of stuff. And again, none of which I'm hugely opposed to. But I just feel like that stuff can all sound a bit weird in a way that intervening in our health and trying to improve the health of human beings doesn't. So I think it's a bit of a semantic issue. It's just a word that's got a load of different social connotations attached. I didn't particularly want to, I wanted to try and make the case that this idea of curing aging is in many ways really uncontroversial. It's just a natural extension of modern medicine, because all that modern medicine, if you're trying to cure cancer, if you're trying to cure HIV, if you're trying to cure malaria, these are all things we try and do. And what they will do is they'll make people live healthier for longer. And what curing aging would do is make people live healthier for longer as well. So I just see it as a natural extension of the research with the medicine we're already doing. And I think attaching a label like transhumanism to it, while it may be accurate and while I may support quite a lot of the goals of the movement, I think it just sort of puts you in certain circles, it can put you in the sort of more freaky category of what's out there and make everything sound a bit weird. And that's something that I wanted to get away from. But yeah, as I say, I support quite a lot of the ideas.
When you first released the book in the UK, what were some of the, because this is a question that I like to ask folks, is what sort of criticisms do people have? What sort of besides semantics, because people who aren't in the know are gonna say, come on, like getting older without getting old, like come on, that's quackery. But for those of us that are understanding of how this works and who are following along and shaking their head with us while they watch or listen to this episode, when you first released the book, like what sort of criticism did you receive? Like where did people find objections? Where did people try to tear down the work that you were doing?
I think the most common objections are sort of ethical, long-term, social, political kind of objections. And this is something I could talk to you about for an hour, because I find it really genuinely fascinating. And this sort of does actually come back a bit to the semantics we were talking about, although you said that, not to mention that, because I think when you talk about curing aging, people really put that in a separate sort of moral, ethical, social, medical category to something like curing cancer, even though, as I said, the goals are effectively all the same. It's people living longer, healthier lives. And so often what I'd find back in the days when we could go to dinner parties and weddings and that sort of stuff, the first thing that someone would ask me when I said I was writing a book on aging was, oh God, what are we going to do with all the people? Aren't we going to have a massively overpopulated planet? And it was surprisingly rare to get a question on, how do you look after your own health? Or, how do you think we're going to achieve this medical breakthrough? Almost always the question is something about overpopulation or something about, won't you get bored with all those extra years, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just find it really fascinating, because imagine that I'd gone to that same wedding and said, oh, I'm working on a book on cancer research about how these new CAR T cell therapies are going to revolutionize the way that we can treat cancer. Literally nobody would say, oh no, now we've got all these octogenarian cancer survivors weighing down the planet. Aren't we going to have environmental disaster? But as soon as you mention aging, then it sort of unlocks an entirely different part of people's brains, and they've got all these sort of ethical questions that come along with it. And the most common answer I give to all of these questions, the one that's sort of the catch-all, regardless of what you get asked, whether it's about, inequality of access or overpopulation or dictators, is to switch the question around and to say, imagine we lived in a world where one of these problems that you're really concerned about was huge. And let's take overpopulation. There are 20 billion people on the planet Earth. Climate change is ravaging the planet. We're abusing all the rainforests. We've got huge amounts of land being used. We're polluting everything. What would you reach for to try and solve that problem? And I would argue that aging is the very last thing you'd go for. Imagine you're all living very, very long lives and excellent health, would you say, okay, the issue is we need to get rid of some people? Well, the first thing is I'd say before you get rid of the people, you should try and reduce your carbon footprint. You should try and reduce the land use that you're using by changing the food that you eat. You should try and, reduce the pollution by changing the ways that you manufacture things and the way that you consume goods in your society. If you'd finally exhausted all of those things, you're like, okay, there's literally no option. We are going to have to kill 5 billion people. Would you do that with a process of gradual deterioration over decades, during which they lose their independence, they lose their mind potentially, and they get these horrible diseases, things like cancer, things like heart disease, that don't just kill you, in your sleep painlessly. They cause years or maybe even decades of suffering that goes along with all that other stuff that's happening at the same time. And I just think the answer is absolutely no. In answer to all of these questions, you'd never invent aging to solve any of these problems. Right. So why is it that we're happy to stand by and let aging, quote unquote, solve these problems, which by the way, it doesn't. That's a sort of a second answer to the question, is whether or not aging actually helps very much. But it just seems crazy to me that people would be willing to let, billions of people suffer and die in order to solve what are often problems that aging isn't really contributing hugely to.
Wow. All right. Let's keep going on this, because this is very fascinating to me too. Yeah. When you pose the question like that, when you're talking about cancer, cure for cancer, or let's keep it even more topical, like the cure for COVID, and people are going to celebrate you. You're going to get 7 Nobel Peace Prizes, and be the hero of planet Earth. But when you're talking about people keeping people alive, which is the same thing, their mind shifts. Because you've thought about this a lot, because you've faced this question a lot, what do you think about? I know this isn't a book about human psychology, but what do you think about the way that we think about humanity or aging or even death makes so many people make that jump and have that objection?
It is really fascinating. I have scratched my head about this, and I don't claim to have all the answers, but I feel like it's because all of us we've over not just over civilizational time, not just over our lives, but over like evolutionary time, we've had the ability to come to terms with aging, because every ancestor of the human race has aged, and therefore our whole society is just built around this fact that you will grow older and you will get more frail. And whether that was people in prehistoric times scratching their heads about what evil gods might have been causing this particular malady, or whether it's in modern times where we've got hospitals, we've got pensions, we've got nursing homes, we've got this whole sort of infrastructure in our society that's built around the understanding that we're all going to get older and we're all going to lose our independence, we're all going to get ill. We just got so used to the idea. We come to terms with it and we just accept it as a natural facet of life. And there's this real distinction between aging and the diseases that aging causes. Right. Because, aging, you used to be able to write died of old age on a death certificate, and that's no longer legal, I think, in most places in the world. Wait a minute. Really? Is that? Yeah, because imagine someone died in their 90s in the 1930s. Yeah. There probably wouldn't have been a huge amount of point trying to scratch your head about exactly why they did. And so doctor could just write died of old age. But now you have to say, they died of cancer, or they died of coronavirus, or they died of whatever it was. And I think that shift, the sort of flip side of it, is that now we associate death with being of a particular cause. Sure. And so if you're a politician, and often these things are because of things that have happened to politicians' relatives and stuff like that. The reason that these initiatives get started for funding science and stuff like that. It might be that a particular member of your family has had a particular kind of brain cancer. So you put some money, you as a politician put some money into researching brain cancer, or maybe one of your family's had Alzheimer's. And again, that's a specific disease. But we just somehow we put all the aging process that gives rise to those diseases in the background. And I really don't know what exactly has caused that from a social science, social history point of view, but it really does seem to be the case that we put those in very, very separate categories. And that's from both a scientific research point of view and from an ethical, philosophical point of view as well. Yeah. Fascinating.
I guess I sort of intuitively knew that cause of death had to be or is largely attributed to something now. I mean, even a generation ago, I'm 37, and talking about being, dying of old age was a pretty common thing. And I guess now as I get older and older, that becomes less and less. It's pointed to, an organ failure or a cardiac event or something like that. Well, it also doesn't help that the third leading cause of death in North America is medical intervention, which can be specifically attributed somewhere, to something like this person got, an infection, or this person, et cetera. But that's really fascinating to me. I hadn't really thought about that. What does this say about how we think about death? There is an inextricable connection between how we age or not age, getting older without getting old, and death. Is there any part of you, and I don't mean to put you in the spot, but I do kind of. What is the connection that you've made, or your sort of personal interest in avoiding death?
I just think, and it's strange, death is sort of the ability of something like curing aging to put off death is almost a side effect. And that's because the things that kill you are ultimately the things that cause you to suffer while you're alive. So if you think about cancer, it's a nasty thing. It invades part of your body. It metastasizes around your body. The treatment for it, the chemotherapy you're going to get is grueling. And so, this is something that you're going to live with for years. You're constantly going to be looking over your shoulder. And it takes it takes away your independence, because it means that you're less able to do the things that you love doing. And I think that, I want to see a world without cancer, without dementia, without heart disease, without all of these things. And if none of those things exist, or at least they've been pushed back to much, much later in life as a result of treatments that can slow or reverse the aging process, then people won't die. And it's not necessarily that I'm terrified about death itself. I don't have lots of sleepless nights because I'm concerned about winking out of existence. So that's obviously is sometimes a concern. But I feel like the most important thing to do is try and reduce suffering. And the knock-on effect of that is to push death further and further back into the future. So it's a strange one, because I think a lot of people think, you've got to go sometime. And that certainly makes sense to me. I think being terrified of death would be pretty counterproductive as a human being. It would be pretty crippling. Right. But at the same time, I sort of argue the point the other way around. I do think death is bad, in the sense that even if it doesn't affect you personally, and you can see the argument, you don't exist, you're not around to experience any suffering. I didn't exist for billions of years in the history of the universe, didn't cause me any problems, etc., etc. But it does cause a huge problem for those people that are left behind. It's incredibly sad for your family, your friends, your community, having to say goodbye to you. And there's this ancient African proverb that one of the philosophers I spoke to for the book quoted, which is that it's something like, every time a man dies, a library burns. Just got all these years, decades, maybe a century of accumulated experience, of wisdom, of knowledge. And it can be everything from the incredibly sort of trivial on a global scale, like how friends and families, and all these different sort of stories, or it can be maybe you're the leading researcher in your particular field, or maybe you're a songwriter who's just got this incredible power to connect with hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and that genius and all that knowledge and wisdom and personality and everything just vanishes. And I think although the death and suffering are to some extent separable, I think if there were less death in the world, that would still be a good thing.
Yeah, well said. I like your approach there. I like your approach. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, they are so tightly tied to one another, aging and death. How do you think that we're going to be able to live? It's increasingly part of sort of the biohacking community that I live in, talking about longevity. I certainly take lots of different things. I went through a senolytics protocol to rid my body of senescent cells. Very experimental. And I've done peptides and exosomes and stem cells injections, for physical ailments, not necessarily so I can live long. But I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated with aging, and I'm fascinated with people that live a long time. And there's these accounts of, Mr. Li Ching Yuan, who supposedly lived to 256 years old, and it was confirmed by the Chinese government and confirmed by like the New York Times in the early 30s. Talks about how he lived on herbs and ginseng and rice wine and long walks, and you sleep like a dog and walk like a pigeon or something like that. Fascinating stuff. Who knows how old he really was, but the fact of the matter is he lived a very, very long time, and there's photos of him, etc. So I'm curious about what, maybe for this generation or soon enough, how long do you think that we're going to be able to live in the future?
It's a really hard question to answer.
I know.
there's an extent to which I'm like a really boring scientist and I never give any like solid numerical predictions. I'm not going to say that people, in their 30s today are going to live to, 157. However, the reason it's really hard to predict is because it's an exciting time to be alive. So, I don't want to like rain on the parade of this sort of stuff, because the way that we're going to cure aging, the way that we're going to end up living, or even if we don't get all the way to the cure, the way that we're going to end up living a very long time is because we're sort of going to bootstrap our efforts. So, if you're in your 30s now, for example, and obviously, people are younger, people are older, in different situations, but say you're in your 30s now, you've got at least 50 years of life left, even assuming nothing remarkable happens to, human life expectancy to anti-aging. And actually, we know that life expectancy is continually increasing. If you look at the leading country around the world, life expectancy, and that obviously varies by year, but that life expectancy, that sort of best in world life expectancy, goes up by about 3 months every year. And it's been doing that, reliably tick-tock since about 1850. So we've got this incredibly long run trend of getting 3 months of free life expectancy every year. So that means that probably our date of death, maybe it'll be something like our 90s or something like that. Who knows? However, we've then got the possibility of all this anti-aging biotechnology. And so senolytic drugs killing these senescent cells are already in clinical trials for humans. So I think it's only going to be a few years before they start handing those out to people for specific diseases. If they're safe, if they're effective, they could get broadened out to the more general population, and maybe people start prescribing them off label, depending on how keen you are. If you're at the sort of biohacker end of things, as you say, you've already tried some of this stuff. Maybe if you're, like me, a bit more cautious, not quite a biohacker, but equally, want to try some of these things, you might try and convince your doctor to, as I say, give you some off label. Maybe if you're super cautious, you'll wait for the absolute, gold standard solid trials to be in or whatever. Nonetheless, the point is that by taking these drugs, hopefully you can add a few years to your healthy lifespan. And that then buys you a few more years for whatever drugs or treatments are coming down the pike next to be developed. And lots of this stuff isn't very far away. So, we talked about gene therapy and stem cell therapy. Those things aren't going to be happening for most people as a sort of general anti-aging treatment in the next 5 years. But I think you'd be crazy to bet against them happening in the next 20 or 30 years. And like I said, we've potentially got 50 years left. And then when you think about, what medicine's going to look like at that time, I've sort of already alluded to this, but in the final science chapter of the book, I have this section at the end talking about reprogramming aging. That's this bit where I talk about trying to restore homeostasis to the body. And when I was writing that, I was writing about the idea that we can, we've got huge computer models that are being developed, that will be developed, that are going to take these enormous quantities of biological data that we're generating. So we've got things like genome sequences. The first sequencing of the human genome was a multi-billion-dollar enormous project.
Right.
And now you can get your genome sequenced for $1,000, probably less, and they can do it in an afternoon.
Yeah.
And that means we've got vastly more biological data than we've ever had at any point in human history by orders and orders of magnitude. And it's not just genomes, we can look at all the proteins inside a cell, we can look at populations of cells. We're really starting to be able to do these enormous, they're called omics studies, so genomics, proteomics, that look in an unbiased way at every single facet of a particular part of an organism or a particular cell. And we're also seeing this enormous increase in computing power. So, we've had Moore's law where computing power has been doubling every couple of years since the 60s or something like that. That's slowed down a bit, but our algorithms are sort of enhancing our ability to catch up. So we've got things like neural networks now. Only a few months ago, we had DeepMind. I'm going to oversimplify this in a way that will annoy protein biologists. They say they solved the protein folding problem. They actually solved an aspect of it, and it's a bit more complicated. But whatever. The point is that they've got the ability to take a neural network, which can then it can work out how a biological system works. It can work out how these proteins sort of go through this origami process that's been an absolute head scratcher for biologists for 50 years. And they've made a huge jump with a single model by applying this deep learning to it. And all of these things point to the fact that we are going to come to a point where we can integrate this huge amount of data with these huge computer models and come up with ways to intervene in our biology that are so much cleverer than just killing senescent cells.
Right.
We'll be able to do something that really optimizes, that trades off all these different side effects. Maybe there are some places where you don't want to delete the senescent cells. Maybe there are some places where you want to change the length of the telomeres a bit, but not so much, or whatever. And there are going to be things that are going to be impossible to describe in human language because they're effectively going to be our computers programming our bodies. And as I was writing this, I was thinking, this really is sort of swerving into the transhumanism that I don't want to mention, and it sounds like some sort of crazy far future stuff. But then I thought a bit more about it, and I was like, well, actually, if you look at what's happened over the last 50 years, it was only in the 1950s that we discovered the structure of DNA, and now we've got this incredible genome sequencing. We've already talked about Moore's law and computing power shooting up in that intervening time. We've got loads of other technologies on the horizon. We're going to be developing new kinds of computer chips. We'll have new materials that we can use for computing. We'll have quantum computers. We're going to develop whole new kinds of machine learning. I think you'd be a fool to bet against the next 50 years seeing those sorts of technologies develop and seeing these models of human biology come to fruition. And as I said, we can expect to hopefully live, another 50, 60 years, even without any advances in biotechnology that are significant. And then you add in the fact that we're hopefully going to have benefited from the first senolytics. There might be drugs like metformin that can slow down aging. We might have had a couple of, sort of the low-hanging fruit in terms of the stem cell treatments, or, maybe we've had a couple of gene therapies that are, the easy stuff, not the really, really complicated nitty-gritty reprogramming biology, but, maybe you'll have had some risk genes taken away, or had, a couple of extra genes added that can degrade a certain kind of cellular waste that your body can't currently handle. Whatever these treatments turn out to be over the next 20, 30, 40 years, if you can then live long enough to benefit from those first, sort of baby steps, systems biology models, maybe you can live another 10 years longer still. And then that gives us 10 years to enhance these models, and so on and so on and so on. So it could be that, we live a solid 100 years and, we're pretty healthy, and, senolytics mean that we get cancer a bit later, and we might get a bit less dementia. Or it could be that if all of this stuff manages to cause some kind of exponential growth, we could live vastly longer. And it's very hard to put a ceiling on it if we are fortunate enough for that to happen. Because if we can slow down and reverse aging sufficiently to buy us that huge amount more time, then who knows how far medicine could go in the lifetimes of, whether it's people alive today or the next generation or the generation after that. It could happen quite soon. And what my sort of bet hedging way of answering this question is always to say this is going to happen in time for most people alive today. And what exactly this, this is that's going to happen is open to a bit of question. But I think we're at a hugely exciting time, and it's because of that we have to be so uncertain.
Yeah, good. I want to live to 120. I want to get to 120. And I figure by the time I get to 60 or 70, I'm going to have enough money to afford the really expensive treatments. I will have dialed in my nutrition and so forth that, the calorie restriction, the fasting, the love that I have in my family, the reduction in stress, the really advanced treatments, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, those sorts of things I'm going to be doing, twice a week or whatever. So that by the time I'm 60 or 70, and I've got grandkids, that I'm going to be able to really be strong and powerful and youthful and vibrant through homeostasis into my 120s. If you had to pick a number, what would your number be?
I wouldn't pick a number.
I know you wouldn't.
As long as I'm healthy and happy and have people I care about around me, and I've got so much to do. I don't want to, and I think this is a really fascinating thing. There are lots of surveys where there aren't actually lots. There are a couple of surveys where people ask, they basically ask, how long would you like to live? And what most people pick is current life expectancy plus about 10 years, because everyone wants to have a good innings, but nobody wants to sort of live into a nursing home into their 110s. Then, if you're a bit more ambitious, you might pick 120. But if you're going to make it to 120, I feel like if biotechnology is good enough that we live to 120, we're not likely to either want to or have to stop there.
Sure.
Because, if you can live that long, that's say you're 35 now, how long is that? It's another 80, 85 years. What on earth is biotechnology going to look like in 85 years' time? I very much hope it'll be able to save whatever a healthy-ish 120-year-old looks like at that point.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't put a number on it. And so that's the sort of medical reason I don't put a number on it. And the personal reason is I've just got so much to do. I'm happy to keep going as long as I'm fit and healthy.
Nice. Good. I figured I'd push a little bit. I think the concept of homeostasis is really important, and the goal of this podcast specifically is to exhaust all of the free resources and then all of the cheap resources and then growing in complexity, right? So intermittent fasting, you're actually going to save money by intermittent fasting. Yeah. You're gonna all these myriad benefits from eating 1 or 2 meals a day. Breath, are you breathing effectively through your nose most of the time, right? Are you having stress reduction protocols? Are you detoxing effectively, et cetera, and all of that is to get to a homeostasis, to let the body do what it wants to do. It's not about enhancement or reduction. It's about just finding that sweet spot. And finding that sweet spot is growing in complexity because what we know about how cells talk to each other, the gut-brain connection, the liver and the the gallbladder, and all these different connections that are really challenging. And there's not really a question here, but that really resonates with me because homeostasis is what is going to, like, if we just stay in that sweet spot, our body knows what to do and knows how to function properly. It knows how to age less, right?
Yeah, it's amazing that our bodies in our 20s and 30s, we literally go for decades with as I said, your odds of death in your 20s and 30s are less than 1 in 1,000 a year. That means like the sort of precision with which your body is maintaining homeostasis is just astonishing. It's like, balancing a pencil on its tip for like 3 or 4 decades. And yet somehow our biological systems have evolved to be able to do that. So if we can just nudge them back into that state, then, we can stay living healthily for a very long time.
Yeah, I love it. Based on that same note of, and a couple more questions before we take it home. Based on that sort of idea that you should do the free stuff or the stuff that saves you money first and sort of grow in complexity of treatments and so forth. What are maybe 3 to 5 things that you think are kind of no-brainers for aging slow or reducing aging that everybody can do and everybody should do?
The first one is absolutely definitely stop smoking. If you smoke, and I suspect not many people listening to this podcast will, honestly, but it's so astronomically bad for you. And since we're talking about things that are free or cheap, like, it will save you so much money, especially, in the UK, rightly, cigarettes are taxed to the nines. And so, you're going to save, loads and loads of money and massively improve your life experience. You can potentially add like 10 years to your life. And 10 years to your healthy life as well. And there's basically nothing else that can do that. So that is number one, like the absolute king of all health suggestions. Exercise, I think, is something that's really, really important. And I'm sure, you talked a lot about all sorts of different things, but I think the most neglected aspect of exercise is probably strength training. And this is something that surprised me when researching the book, is that it seems that an awful lot of the age-related decline in muscle mass and the age-related decline in muscle strength is reversible. And there are even these amazing studies where they give people in their 90s a program of strength training. And what they find is that after a few months of doing this sort of resistance training stuff, they can walk further, they're just a bit stronger. They have pretty substantial benefits, even though they're that late in life, because your muscles do have this latent ability. So a significant part of our loss of strength is just basically loss of use or lack of use. So I really feel like exercise, and in particular, is often quite neglected. We often talk about cardio. You can really feel how that's benefiting your circulatory system and your lungs, but don't forget your muscles. Those are really important too. Eating wise, I've flirted with fasting, but I just find it so hard. And I really think that again, this is me being like, perhaps I'm asking for the evidence to be too watertight, but I really feel like the evidence is not 100% there for whether it's going to work for humans. It absolutely works in so many species. It works in, yeast, it works in worms, it works in flies, it works in spiders, dogs, probably monkeys. The experiments are a bit uncertain. And then the only trials that we've got in humans inevitably are quite short term. They do it for a year or two. And people definitely get healthier. But the question is, does that translate into living longer? And for me, maybe I'm just a very grouchy, hungry person, so I just find it very hard to stick to. But there are some disbenefits as well. There's supposed to be, there's a bit of an impact on immunity potentially. Some of the people in the trials have had to drop out because they've noticed their bones have started to get thinner or they've started to get anemia. It has an impact on your sex drive. The people who do it report that hunger never goes away, which is really frustrating because you might sort of hope that after a few months of eating less, then your body will sort of adapt to that new normal, but you just stay hungry all the time, which I think is the aspect that I really couldn't cope with. There's this actually a joke. You find that scientists are a cynical lot, and there's a joke in the biogerontology community that intermittent fasting or calorie restriction won't make you live any longer, but it will certainly feel like longer.
Right.
But equally, like I've got a huge amount of sympathy for people who do it. And the reason being, as I was researching that chapter, it actually ended up not being a chapter. It ended up going in all sorts of places around the book because it touches on so many parts of the biology. But you just feel like there must be some optimal diet out there because there are so many experiments that have tried so many different things. And this dietary restriction effect is, as I said before, just so consistent across the animal kingdom. And we know that some of the sort of biological mechanisms that that cause it to work are also conserved. So we have the same, proteins inside our cells as a yeast cell has that enact this dietary restriction. So I really feel like there's something out there. but there was just nothing that really grabbed. If I knew I could get an extra 10 years of life by fasting, I think I could probably like overcome my grumpiness. But given that I'm really not sure what the benefits are going to be and that I like food, that's how I've ended up coming down here. That's not to say I won't change my mind. I'm really open to evidence, but I'm just not 100% sure about actually, going as far as fasting. So is that 3? What am I going to say is number 4? I think number 4 is going to be one of the ones that surprised me, which is brush your teeth. And there are obviously good reasons from a sort of dental standpoint to do
Sure.
that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
There's quite good evidence that it doesn't just reduce your dental bills and stop decay, but it can also reduce your risk of heart disease and your risk of dementia. And the dementia link is a bit more tenuous. We're not 100% sure, but the heart disease one seems relatively solid. And the rationale behind this is a process called chronic inflammation, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of. This idea that as you get older, your immune system starts to get sort of set on this sort of low-level paranoia, basically. It's constantly on a low state of alert, and that then goes on to accelerate the aging process. And if you imagine that you're someone who's got gum disease or you've got tooth decay, these are infections that are in your mouth. They're caused by bacteria. And those infections are something that your immune system finds very hard to shift. You never quite get rid of them. And that means there's this constant sort of low-level skirmish going on in your mouth. And that means there's a constant state of inflammation. And that inflammation can drive problems all around the body. And it seems to be relatively solidly linked to heart disease. So it seems that, if you have bad oral health, that will go on to give you bad heart health. The dementia link could be related to inflammation. So again, inflammation in the brain is something that can drive cognitive decline and dementia. But also we found that some of the bacteria that are responsible for gum disease have been found in the amyloid plaques that are the plaques of proteins that clump together in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. So we don't know if that's cause or effect. It could be that those bacteria are just taking advantage of the sort of diseased brain and they're being opportunistic and sneaking in, or it could be that they have gone into the brain and this amyloid is acting as some kind of strange defense against the bacteria, and so maybe they're the first mover. We don't really know which way the causality lies, but again, that's enough for me to want to brush my teeth and make sure that I'm on top of things in that department. And my final tip, I think, would be measure your heart rate and blood pressure. And I haven't actually got a smartwatch. My wife has, so it's not something I'm massively opposed to. But I really think that the one thing they don't measure that's really, really valuable is knowing your blood pressure, because blood pressure is behind so many different diseases and illnesses. Heart disease is the obvious one, but it can also again be behind dementia because it can cause high pressure in your brain, in the blood vessels in your brain, and that can make strokes more likely, or it can cause thousands and thousands of really tiny mini strokes that go on to cause a problem called vascular dementia. Anyway, basically it's responsible for absolutely loads of different problems around the body, but it's a completely silent problem. If you've got high blood pressure, you can't really feel it, you can't see it, it just doesn't have any symptoms until you develop one of these much more cataclysmic problems, you potentially end up having a stroke. So just by sticking on the blood pressure cuff, sit down, measure your blood pressure, once or twice a week, maybe. Just keep an eye on it. Make sure it's within the sort of normal range. And if it does end up going above, I think 140/80 is sort of the point at which you should probably, if you're getting that reading consistently, go and see your doctor and have a chat with them to see if there's anything they can do. The best interventions are things like diet and exercise, actually. So, as long as you're following that advice relatively well, your blood pressure should stay under control. Yeah. But again, just because it's something that you can't feel, you can't sense without measuring it, I think it's really worthwhile. It's so cheap. Blood pressure cuffs are like, what, £20, $20, maybe $30, $40, I don't know. But, they're not expensive devices and you can use them for years and years. So I think that's a real no-brainer. It's something that I was put onto by my other half, as I say, as a doctor. But I think having read about the broader aging consequences, she was totally right.
That's cool. Oh, those are really great. Those are really, really great. Thanks for laying those out. Before I ask the final question, which is a fill in the blank question, where can people learn more about you? Where can they find the book, etc.? Give us all your vitals.
So if you want to buy the book, you can go to ageless.link and that'll give you a variety of different bookshops. It's available. And obviously, if you just Google Ageless Andrew Steele, that'll come up as well. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Stato, which is STATTO. I'm also on YouTube, youtube.com/Dr. Andrew Steele, Dr. Andrew Steele, all one word. And I'm hoping to put up a few videos, particularly about the sort of ethics stuff that isn't covered quite so much in the book, but also about all aspects of aging and the health advice. And I've got big plans, but I've been so busy. I haven't put out a huge number of videos in the last couple of months for some reason. Yeah. I'm not sure what that could possibly have been.
Yeah, no, a comprehensive book maybe, or...
So yeah, I think those are the places I'd recommend people go.
Excellent. So this last final question is I asked this for everybody. It's a fill in the blank. So this can be based on anything that specific to the book or just your experience in life in any way. Feel free to elaborate as much or as little as you like. Please fill in the blank. everyone would benefit from knowing
that aging is a process that we can slow down and reverse. And obviously that is the whole point of my book, right? But I really think that if that fact was just understood more widely, and as I sort of said before, this is biologists, this is members of the public, tell your friends, your family, when we're allowed back to bars, I want this to be something that people talk about in the pub. I want it to be such common knowledge that we can't fail to do something about it. Because, there is health advice that you can follow. When I launched this book in the UK, it was the new year. And so I was doing a lot of New Year's resolutions. And so, I tell people about a lot of that health advice that we've just discussed. I pick and choose from that. But I said that perhaps the strongest, most important New Year's resolution is one that's going to sound quite weird. And that is, I think you should campaign for more funding for aging biology. Because I think that without that funding, we're not going to see the developments that are going to allow us to live a long time. And I think if you are already, living a relatively optimal life, eating relatively well, getting a bit of exercise, not smoking, all that stuff that we talked about before, the single biggest determinant of how long you live is going to be progress in aging biology. And so it's so important, contact your representatives, tell them about this, maybe send them a copy of my book. And I'm not just saying this to sell books. It's because I genuinely, passionately believe that if more people understood that treating aging is a thing that we should be doing as a society, as a species, then that's what's going to make all of us live longer, healthier lives.
Well said. Hear, hear. Tell your friends, share this episode, tag both of us in Instagram posts, share this episode, get it around. I mean, this has been really eye-opening. I really like the way that you've put things together. I like your approach and your sort of measured way and the way in which you're discussing this stuff. So this has been great. Dr. Steele, thank you so much for joining me today on the Optimal Performance Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
And scene.